The notice was simple. 30 days. Black ink on white paper. Calm, legal, final. I slid it across the table without raising my voice. No anger, no threats, just facts. The kind that don't need emotion to carry weight. I watched their faces as they read it, or pretended to. Smiles crept in, slow and careless, like people who believe rules are for others. 30 days. One of them laughed. "You're serious?" I nodded. Silence does that. It invites people to reveal who they really are. They had been living there long enough to forget whose house it was. Comfort has a way of rewriting history. What started as a favor slowly turned into entitlement. Rent delayed, boundaries ignored, respect replaced by arrogance. Still, I said nothing. I waited, I observed, and when the time came, I did exactly what the law allowed me to do. Nothing more, nothing less. But they didn't see it that way. They saw quiet as fear. They saw patience as surrender. One of them leaned back in the chair, arms crossed, confidence dripping from every careless word. "You won't do anything. You never do." That sentence hung in the air longer than it should have. I wanted to correct them. I wanted to explain that silence isn't absence, it's control. But I didn't. People learn better through consequences than conversations. They joked about the notice that night. I heard it through the walls. Laughter, music, glasses clinking. They were celebrating the idea that I was weak, that I would fold like I always had. What they didn't understand was this: I wasn't folding. I was stepping back to see the whole board. Each day after that, they pushed a little more. Dirty dishes left intentionally, doors slammed, messages ignored. It wasn't accidental. It was performance, meant to provoke, to test how far they could go. I passed them in the hallway, nodded politely, and kept walking. That scared them more than anger ever could, because when someone stops reacting, it forces others to imagine what's coming next. On day 7, they confronted me again. Louder this time, bolder. One of them waved the notice in my face. "You think a piece of paper scares us?" I looked at it, then at them, and said just 3 words. "It's enough." They laughed again. But this time it was shorter, less confident. That night I opened a folder I had been quietly building. Lease agreements, payment records, dates. Every late excuse documented, every broken promise logged. Silence had given me time, and I had used every second wisely. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. I was focused. By day 15, their tone shifted. Subtle, but noticeable. Questions disguised as jokes. "So what happens after 30 days anyway? You're not really serious, right?" I answered the same way every time, with silence. People fear what they can't read, and they couldn't read me anymore. By day 20, the house felt tense. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Their laughter sounded forced now, like a shield cracking under pressure. They were beginning to understand that the notice wasn't a suggestion. It was a countdown. On the final week, one of them knocked on my door late at night. Different voice, softer, nervous. "Can we talk?" I opened the door, listened, and said nothing while they explained. Apologies mixed with excuses, regret blended with desperation. When they finished, they waited for my response like children waiting for permission. I finally spoke. "The notice still stands." Their face fell. Reality arrived uninvited. They walked away slowly, no laughter left, no confidence to lean on. And as I closed the door, I felt nothing but clarity. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Silence makes arrogant people brave. The quieter I became, the louder they grew. It was as if my calm fed something ugly inside them, an assumption that I had no spine, no plan, no power. They walked heavier through the house now, claimed more space, spoke my name like it belonged to them. I watched it all. Arrogance has a pattern. First, it mocks. Then it provokes. Finally, it overreaches. They were already in the second stage. By the second week, my things began to disappear, not stolen outright, just borrowed. My chair moved. My tools used without permission. Food eaten, then denied. Each small act was deliberate, designed to test how much disrespect I would tolerate. I tolerated all of it. That confused them. One evening, one of them stood in the doorway, blocking my path, grinning like a child who'd learned a bad trick. "You're really not going to do anything, are you?" I met their eyes for a moment, just long enough to let them wonder, and then walked past without a word. The grin faded behind me. People who thrive on confrontation don't know how to fight silence. They need resistance. They need noise. Without it, they're left alone with their own thoughts, and that's where fear begins. Behind closed doors, I continued my work. Phone calls made quietly, emails sent calmly. Procedures followed precisely. I didn't rush. Rushing leads to mistakes, and mistakes are expensive. They, on the other hand, rushed everything. They started lying. To me, to each other, to themselves. One said they'd already found a new place. Another claimed they knew people who could make problems disappear. Big words from small minds. I let them talk. On day 18, I overheard something that confirmed everything. One of them whispered, "Hayes bluffing. If he was serious, he would have yelled by now." That's when I knew they had learned nothing. They still believed power announces itself loudly. They didn't understand that the most dangerous moves happen quietly behind neutral expressions and locked folders. I thought back to all the times in my life when silence had been misread. Teachers who thought I wasn't paying attention. Colleagues who assumed I lacked ambition. Friends who mistook patience for passivity. Every time, the pattern was the same. They underestimated me until it was too late. At dinner that night, the tension finally cracked. Voices rose. Accusations flew. They spoke over one another, pointing fingers, trying to decide who should handle me. I sat at the table, finished my meal, stood up, and cleared my plate. The room went quiet. "You don't care at all, do you?" One of them snapped. I paused at the doorway. "Care," I said calmly, "doesn't require noise." That sentence followed me down the hall like a shadow. From that moment on, the house changed. Doors locked. Conversations stopped. They began treating me like a problem instead of a person, and that was perfect. Problems get solved. I noticed panic creeping into their routines. Phone calls taken outside. Late-night arguments whispered through walls. They were scrambling now, trying to reverse time, trying to undo the confidence they had wasted so freely. But deadlines don't care about regret. By day 22, one of them tried kindness, compliments, offers to help. Fake smiles stretched thin with desperation. I accepted none of it. Kindness used as currency is just another form of manipulation. They had chosen their approach. I was simply letting it play out. That night, I wrote one final note in my records. A simple line with a date and a time. The kind of detail that turns stories into evidence. I slept better than I had in weeks, because I knew something they didn't yet understand. Silence isn't weakness. It's restraint. It's preparation. It's the pause before the door closes. And when that door finally shut, there would be no argument left to make. They were still laughing occasionally, short bursts forced and hollow, but the sound no longer filled the house. It echoed, and echoes mean the space is almost empty. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. Soon they would mistake it for mercy. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks boring. And that's why most people never see it coming. While they slept late and argued loudly, I woke early and moved carefully. Mornings were my sanctuary, quiet enough to think, quiet enough to plan. I learned quickly that power favors those who respect time. Every hour I spent in silence was an hour they wasted in denial. They still believed nothing was happening. I let them. Behind my closed door, the world was orderly. Papers stacked neatly. Dates highlighted. Copies made twice. I read every clause, every line that people usually skip. I didn't skim. I studied. Because when the moment arrives, ignorance offers no protection. They thought strength came from confrontation, from raised voices and slammed doors. They didn't realize strength often wears the face of patience. One afternoon, I overheard them joking about changing the locks someday. Just to see his face. One of them laughed. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was casual. That kind of disrespect only grows when unchecked. I wrote it down. People forget their words. I don't. Every interaction became a data point. Who said what? Who was present? Who laughed? Silence gave me clarity. Emotion never entered the equation. I wasn't collecting revenge. I was collecting truth. They started slipping. Late rent they once denied suddenly became temporary delays. Promises made loudly turned into excuses whispered late at night. Their unity fractured. Stress exposes cracks, and theirs were widening by the day. On day 24, one of them snapped at another over something small, dirty shoes in the hallway. The argument escalated fast. I stood behind my door, listening, understanding something important. Fear had arrived, not fear of me, but fear of the unknown. Fear of consequences, fear of time running out. That night I made my final preparations. No emotion, no second guessing, just execution. The kind of work that never gets credit because it doesn't look heroic. I backed everything up. Documents, records, timelines. I rehearsed nothing because I wouldn't need to speak much. The truth, when presented correctly, speaks for itself. They knocked on my door again. This time, it wasn't one person, it was two. The tone had changed completely. No sarcasm, no laughter, just tension wrapped in forced politeness. "We should talk," one of them said. I opened the door and listened. They talked about misunderstandings, about stress, about how things had gotten out of hand. Apologies appeared suddenly, like rain after drought, too late to matter. When they finished, they waited. I said, "The timeline hasn't changed." That was all. They looked at each other, searching for weakness, bargaining for mercy. They found neither. Silence is firm when it has purpose. After they left, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, but calm. The kind that comes from knowing you've done everything right. Outside my room, the house felt smaller. Their voices sounded distant now. The confidence that once filled the space had drained away, leaving behind unease and second thoughts. They started packing without admitting it. Small bags at first, boxes that appeared overnight and disappeared by morning. Denial was giving way to reality. On day 26, one of them tried intimidation, raised voice. Accusations, threats disguised as warnings. I listened, nodded once, and closed my door. Nothing scares desperate people more than a closed door. That evening, I marked the final date on my calendar, just one word beside it. Enough. I slept deeply that night. Because while they had spent 30 days testing boundaries, I had spent them building certainty. Every step documented, every option considered, every move legal, clean, and irreversible. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. But silence isn't empty, it's loaded. And when it finally speaks, it does so with precision. Tomorrow wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be dramatic. It would be final. Confidence doesn't vanish all at once. It fractures first. The morning it happened, I could feel it in the air. The house was quieter than usual, not peaceful, but alert like an animal sensing a trap it can't see. Doors opened slowly. Voices stayed low. Even their footsteps sounded uncertain now. This was the day their certainty collapsed. I left my room early, dressed simply, carrying nothing but a folder under my arm. No dramatic gestures, no announcement. Power doesn't need to introduce itself, it just arrives. They noticed the folder immediately. "What's that?" one of them asked, trying to sound casual. "Documentation," I replied. The word landed harder than any insult. They exchanged looks. The bravado they once wore so easily no longer fit. Confidence had been replaced with calculation. They were finally realizing this wasn't a fight of opinions, it was a matter of facts. Later that afternoon, the tension boiled over. One of them confronted me in the living room, voice shaking between anger and fear. "You think you're smarter than us?" I met their eyes calmly. "I think I'm prepared." That was the moment everything shifted. Fear entered their expressions, not the loud kind, but the quiet, creeping kind that tightens the chest. They started talking faster, contradicting themselves, reaching for control that was already gone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I simply waited. Waiting is powerful when time is on your side. They accused me of being heartless, of planning this from the beginning, of smiling while they suffered. I said nothing. The truth didn't need defending, it was already documented. By evening, their unity broke completely. Arguments erupted behind closed doors. Blame bounced from one person to another. Someone yelled. Someone slammed a door hard enough to rattle the walls. I sat quietly in my room, listening not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. On day 28, they tried one last tactic pressure, a group confrontation. All of them standing together as if numbers could change reality. "We're not leaving," one of them said. "You can't make us." I nodded once. "I don't have to." Those 4 words drained the color from their faces. They finally understood that the fight wasn't in this house anymore. It had moved beyond raised voices and intimidation. It had entered a space where feelings don't matter, only proof does. That night I heard panic in their whispers. Calls made to people who didn't answer. Plans falling apart in real time. Reality has a way of isolating those who depend on bluff. They packed faster now, no longer pretending. Bags left by the door. Important items grabbed first. Fear has priorities. On day 29, one of them sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the notice they once laughed at. The paper was wrinkled now, corners folded and unfolded too many times. "Why didn't you just yell at us?" they asked quietly. I paused. "Because yelling is what people do when they don't have options." They looked away. That night, sleep avoided the house entirely. Lights stayed on. Movements continued until dawn. The countdown had become unbearable. When morning came, I felt no excitement, only resolve. The kind that doesn't shake. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. What they were learning now was far more unsettling. Silence is certainty, and certainty leaves no room for negotiation. The law doesn't argue. It doesn't explain itself twice. It simply arrives. The morning it happened, there was a knock on the door that sounded different from all the others before it. Not aggressive, not hesitant, certain, measurable. They froze. I watched from the hallway as panic spread across their faces. The confidence they had worn like armor for weeks cracked completely. One of them whispered, "Who is that?" I already knew. I opened the door calmly. Papers were presented, names were read, dates confirmed. No raised voices, no emotion, just procedure moving forward exactly as it was designed to. They tried to interrupt. Excuses tumbled out fast and tangled. Stories changed mid-sentence. Promises resurfaced, suddenly urgent and sincere. None of it mattered. The law doesn't care about tone. It cares about timelines. As the officials spoke, I noticed something strange. I felt lighter, not triumphant, not relieved, just unburdened. Silence had done its job, and now it was being replaced by authority that couldn't be intimidated. One of them tried to appeal to me directly. "You could stop this. You still can." I looked at them and said, "This stopped being personal a long time ago." That was the truth. They had made it about power, about testing limits, about mistaking kindness for weakness. I had simply let the system do what it was meant to do. The house felt smaller as reality set in. Their voices dropped, shoulders slumped. Every step they took now was cautious, like the ground might give way beneath them. They were given instructions, clear, unavoidable, time stamped. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was a conclusion. As they moved through the house collecting their belongings, the chaos they once enjoyed returned, but now it was frantic instead of careless. Drawers slammed, bags overfilled, items dropped and forgotten. Fear doesn't pack neatly. One of them stopped in the doorway of my room, eyes red, pride gone. "You planned this?" they said quietly. I nodded. "I prepared." There's a difference. Planning is emotional. Preparation is disciplined. They had prepared nothing. No backups, no alternatives, just confidence built on my silence. And confidence, when unsupported, collapses fast. The officials remained patient but firm. Deadlines were enforced. Every minute counted now. The same urgency they had ignored for 30 days had finally found them. I watched as they handed over keys. watched as excuses dissolved into resignation, watched as power returned to where it belonged, without shouting, without cruelty, just order. When the door finally closed behind them, the sound echoed through the house like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Period. The officials left. The house went still. I stood alone in the silence they once mocked, feeling its weight differently now, not as a shield, but as peace. They had called me weak, passive, afraid to confront, but silence had allowed me to move without resistance, to act without interference. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. As I walked through the rooms, I noticed the damage they left behind. Scuffed walls, broken promises, lingering tension in the air. None of it surprised me. Disrespect always leaves a mess. But messes can be cleaned. Regret is harder. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. What they learned instead was this: silence is patience with teeth. And when the law speaks, it speaks in a language excuses can't translate. The house didn't celebrate their departure. There was no dramatic silence, no sudden feeling of triumph. Just stillness, deep, honest, and unfamiliar. The kind that forces you to listen to your own breathing. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. I stood in the doorway long after they were gone, keys heavy in my hand, absorbing the weight of finality. 30 days of noise, disrespect, and false confidence had ended without a single argument in the end. That felt right. I walked through each room slowly, not inspecting damage, not counting losses, just reclaiming space. Space they had filled with entitlement. Space they believed they owned simply because I had allowed them to stay. Keenness can be dangerous when misunderstood. In the kitchen, a chair was pushed back awkwardly, as if someone had stood up too quickly. In the living room, the air still carried traces of their voices. I opened windows, letting fresh air move through, sweeping away what didn't belong anymore. Regret lingers longer than people do. I thought about the moment they laughed at the notice. How confident they had been. How sure that my silence meant surrender. They never asked why I wasn't panicking. Never wondered why I didn't beg or threaten or argue. People who rely on noise don't recognize discipline when they see it. I sat down and finally allowed myself to feel, not anger, not joy, but understanding. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a lesson about boundaries. About what happens when patience is mistaken for permission. Silence isn't the absence of strength, it's the control of it. That truth had cost them everything. Over the next few days, the house began to feel like mine again. Objects returned to their proper places. The tension that once wrapped around every hallway slowly dissolved. Mornings felt lighter, nights felt earned. No more listening for footsteps, no more preparing for confrontation, no more explaining myself to people who never wanted to understand. They reached out once. A message filled with apologies and soft words. I read it without emotion and didn't reply. Closure doesn't always require a response. Some lessons must echo unanswered. I locked the door that night and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Not because I was afraid, but because I was grateful. Grateful that I had trusted silence when others doubted it. Grateful that I had chosen patience over impulse. Impulse creates stories. Patience creates outcomes. They had walked away with regret because they chose arrogance. Because they believed power was loud. Because they underestimated restraint. I turned off the lights and let the house rest. This was the victory they would never understand, not the eviction, not the legal finality, but the calm that followed. The peace that comes when you don't have to prove anything anymore. They would tell their version of the story. Paint themselves as victims. Claim surprise. Claim unfairness. I didn't need to correct them. The truth didn't live in their words. It lived in my silence. They mistook it for weakness. And by the time they realized what it really was, there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to take, and no door left to knock on. Some people learn through explanation, others learn through consequence. I simply chose the method that lasts.